Good morning, friends. My name is Catherine, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for Path Employment Services. Welcome to our series, Let's Talk Careers. Path is hosting these conversations to give some insight for anyone who may be thinking of starting their career and navigating and looking for more info, or maybe they're changing their career, looking for a different path. And what this does is allows them to hear a personal journey from each of our guests who share their challenges and accomplishments and how they got to where they are today. So today I'd like to introduce our guest, Teddy Katz. Hi, Teddy, and thanks for joining me today on Let's Talk Careers.
Morning, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
How do you like that snow out there?
Yeah, it's a bit unexpected, but we haven't had that much so far this year. So
No,
nice to,
we've been lucky this winter. We've been very lucky for the weather.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I thought I would start off rather than jump into where you are now to maybe ask you about your first job, or maybe the first job you had that kind of, left you with an impression and like guided you on your path to your career.
Well, I'll start with the first job that I had. My family, I come from a family that ran a family auto parts business in Hamilton. And so I grew up at the family run business. And from that, I learned a few things. I learned about hard work because they were there basically all the time.
Mhm.
It was, for those who would remember, it was Parkdale Auto Parts. So it became kind of this incredible place, incredibly busy hub of activity. I would
Mhm.
go every weekend to work there with my father and his brothers. And I learned from them. My dad actually left university in his first year to go and work at the family business. So he wasn't formally educated, but
Mhm.
he was one of the smartest people that I ever met. And he had an encyclopedic memory. This was before the time of computers, and he was the inventory, supply chain manager type thing. And he would just write all this stuff down. He knew all the part name. He had everything memorized, like you wouldn't believe, Catherine. So I learned from that. I learned my dad was also very good with making connections with people and his brothers. And anybody who came into the store never went away empty handed. So I learned from that the importance of building connections, of creating a network and having people sort of feel like they're part of the family. And that was something, while it wasn't anywhere close to the career path that I went
Mhm.
down the road of, which was journalism, it gave me some real strong foundations as a base for anything that I was going to do afterwards.
So basically life skills that you can't really learn anywhere else, but like living the experience.
Absolutely, and it was just incredible to see, and it was an incredible place to gain some of those early life skills.
That's an amazing opportunity. Not many youth have that opportunity at a young age to get that kind of education, life experience, especially with family that you can trust. And that was a good opportunity. So where did you go from there? What was like your education like? Where, tell me a bit about Teddy's path.
Yeah, so I was always very curious about sort of current events.
Hmm.
And I was a pretty good student in high school. In fact, my friends probably remember me being a bit of a bookworm. I would be studying for exams that were like 3 months away. And that was just me because I just felt I had to do that kind of hard work in order to be a really good student. And curiosity sort of came out in the sense that I I just looked around the world around me and I wanted to know more. So I was pretty good at writing essays, and given that coupled with the curiosity sort of led me down the path of applying to journalism school. And
Hmm.
when I went for 4 years to Carleton University in Ottawa, had a great experience there. And I can remember actually friends of mine actually will say back to me that they remember me saying at that time that I was going to be or wanted to be a sports journalist.
Oh,
And
interesting.
and I meant it in a way that was a little bit different than when people might think of sports. Like for me, sport was kind of this avenue into understanding the world in a different way. And it's
Mhm.
such an important part of our culture, yet sometimes we don't see it that way. We don't appreciate the stories behind the stories. And I was always wired to really look at, sports stories in that way. And that was kind of the path that I remember actually people saying to me that that's what you said you wanted to do, Teddy. So
Hmm.
eventually, when I got to CBC years later, that's actually what I ended up doing, which I sometimes have to, give my head a shake to see that I was able to accomplish what I was sort of dreaming about from a pretty early age. But it took a lot, Catherine, to get there.
Yeah. So where did you, so after school, did you get right into journalism? Did you?
Yeah, so I worked for a short period of time at this television advertising channel where I was
Mhm.
kind of the copywriter. And the challenging part with that, it was a great opportunity and I learned a lot as well. But every single ad, every single small business that we worked with wanted us to say something similar about their business. So it was one of the most challenging writing jobs I've ever had because how can you show some creativity and make everybody look different when they all want to say the same thing? And
Mhm.
from there, I ended up having and working as a bit of a freelancer and for the Hamilton Spectator in Glanbrook for a little while. I got some small gigs doing some stories for different media outlets, including the CBC. And then probably what was most interesting that I could kind of share with your viewers was I decided that I had to get off the beaten path. If I'm going to compete with all of the people in my field that want to work in Toronto in the major media hubs, I can't stay in the GTA. I can't stay in Hamilton if I'm going to do that. So
Mhm.
one of my friends from Carleton University had started working for CBC out in Moncton in New Brunswick. And I had made arrangements to go and visit her. And while I was out there, she said to me, "You have to go and meet." There's three different CBC stations in New Brunswick, radio stations. You should go out and meet with one of the executive producers there because they're always looking for good people with great ideas and who they can help develop. So
Mhm.
I went out there. I wasn't really prepared. I didn't really have, suit or proper clothing for the interview. But I went out there. I did an interview with the executive producer in Fredericton, and he said, "Yeah, I want to hire you for a month." And that month ended up becoming another month, and then another month after that, and that led to 2 years of these short-term contracts
Mhm.
one after the other, and 2 years of this incredible opportunity to develop my skills as a journalist, doing almost every job that you can imagine in this, even producing in the morning. They had this morning show that ran from 6 to 9 in the morning, even producing the show and coming up with ideas for it. And they said to me, it's kind of similar to the time that we're living right now, Catherine, where, they were very difficult economic times. A lot of people were being laid off. So there weren't a lot of jobs to be had. But they
Mhm.
said to me, during that whole 2 year process, they said to me, when a job does become available, you'll be first in line.
Mhm.
And then what ended up happening was right before they had what they call the board, where they actually interview the top candidates for the position, somebody else in the CBC building had lost their position as a TV reporter, and they were looking for a position for her in somewhere to stay on at CBC. And ended up becoming the top candidate ahead of me for the position that they had available. So, it was a very, very hard time, because I had basically gone out to New Brunswick, lived there on my own without really knowing too many people. I had sacrificed a lot in the hopes that I was going to get a full-time position. And then when the full-time position became available, they gave it to somebody else. So I remember actually going into the executive producer's office, and I think I was, one of these young pups who thought he knew everything. And I went in and I said to him, "I think you made a mistake. Like, I really think that you had told me for 2 years to do all this stuff. I did everything that you asked. I have all this skill set, and you gave the job to somebody else. I'm going to show you that you made a mistake." And interestingly enough, a few years later, when I was in CBC working in Toronto, back in Toronto years later, which we'll get to some of the journey to get there. But he actually, that executive producer was actually working for CBC in another location in Thunder Bay years later. And he called the national newsroom where I was then working. And I answered the phone and he said, "Is that you, Teddy?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You remember all those years ago, you told me that you're going to prove me wrong with the decision that we made?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, you did that." I was like, wow, like I would not recommend that approach to your viewers, but I guess at some points in life, things that are the most hard experiences for you to go through sometimes can be the best thing that happened to you. And just to follow up on what happened, when I didn't get the job, I was distraught. I was not knowing where I was going to go next. And one of the interesting things that happened, and this kind of speaks maybe to serendipity or things are meant to happen for a reason, but one of my friends in the CBC plant in Fredericton came into the office around that time that I didn't get the job. And she had a Spanish English dictionary in her hands. And she said to me, "Teddy, I'm thinking of taking this Spanish language course at University of New Brunswick at night over the next 6 months. Would you like to take the course with me?" And I'm like, "Why would I take this Spanish course? It'll be like all the French that I studied. I won't have a chance to use it, and then I'll lose it."
Yeah.
And I went home that weekend, Catherine, and I started to think, well, what's my long-term goal? And I remember I said I wanted to be a sports journalist. That's what I thought. Well, my long-term goal, 5-year plan was, okay, I want to get to plant myself as a reporter at the next Olympics. And this was early 90s. I had in my mind, I want to get to the Olympics in Atlanta in 1996. It was the centennial year of the games. So they were celebrating 100-year anniversary of the Olympics. That's where I want to be. And I started to think, well, wait a second, that's 5 years from now. That's a long time. The next Olympics, the next Summer Olympics is actually in Barcelona in 1992. It's a year and a half from now. I can go and learn Spanish. And if I learn Spanish, I can go and plant myself, just like I did in New Brunswick. I can go do that in Spain as a freelance journalist. And I could be that reporter that I want to be as an Olympic journalist, a sports journalist in Barcelona, because it's tough economic times. I knew that CBC, who I'd been doing a lot of work with at that point, they're not going to have money to send a whole big crew. So maybe I could plant myself and be one of their crew over there. Let me give that a shot. So that's the direction I decided to go. What was interesting at that point was I really didn't know what I needed to do in order to make that happen. I tried to do as much homework as possible. That's another takeaway that I'd like to leave with the viewers is the more you can take these calculated risks, but do as much homework and preparation by speaking to people who've done it before you. And people are so willing to share. Like that's the most amazing thing. So at CBC in Fredericton, there was a legislative reporter who I didn't really know all that well, but he had gone to the Olympics in 1988 to cover them for CBC. And I said to him, "Do you have time for me to take you out for lunch so that I can pick your brain about everything that I need to be thinking about in order to go and plant myself as a reporter and cover these Olympics in Barcelona?" He said, "Absolutely, like free lunch, I'm all for it." So when I took him out for lunch, almost the first thing out of his mouth was, "So you have your accreditation?" And there's a big long pause, like now. And I said to him, "Well, Rick, I tried to apply for accreditation, but I'm a mid-20s person at that point with very little track record of very little to show for all, for my years of in my career because I was still fairly young." So when I called the Canadian Olympic Association, which was what they were called at that time, the person in charge of giving out the accreditations was a gruff, been in the business 20, 30 years, dealt with it all. And he says to me, there's 300 journalists in Canada that want to do what you're asking to do. And you have to get in line. And, I don't have all of, all the accreditations that people are asking for. So I don't think you're going to have any chance whatsoever of getting one. So I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but that's not possible. So I said that to Rick. And again, there's a pause because he's sort of saying, well, yeah. So he said no. So what did you do about it? And I'm like, well, what am I going to do? Like, he's already told me no. What more can I do at this stage? And he said to me, you have to go and get in front of this man. He has his office in Ottawa. You have to go and plead your case. So I took his advice and I drove back to Hamilton. I'm staying at my parents' house. It's kind of a day like today where we have the world's worst snowstorm of that summer, or sorry, of that winter. And I get up to Ottawa about 12 hours later because this trip that normally takes half that time, I'm almost driving off the road a million times because of the weather. And I get up there only to realize, I'm 5 minutes away from his office and I'm thinking, oh my God, like, what am I actually going to say to him? He's already told me no once. Like, what's my argument? What new am I going to be able to bring to the table? And in that interim period, Catherine, I had actually reached out to CBC, to my contacts there who I'd worked with while I was in New Brunswick. I had reached out to other publications like this one cycling magazine called Pedal Magazine. I'd reached out to about four or five different places. And they had all said, if you get yourself to Barcelona, we'll hire you as a freelancer.
Oh, wow.
So, and we will join forces with you. So when I got into his office 5 minutes later, I didn't actually have to say anything to him. He actually, as I'm walking in the door, he says to me, well, it's great to meet you. Here's your accreditation. You're doing me a huge favor because instead of having to worry about accreditations for 5 different organizations, you're one person handling all those 5 organizations for me. So here you go. And I think the message there and the key takeaway was, if somebody sees how much work that you're doing behind the scenes to make life easier for them, they're going to love you and they're going to be impressed by you, and you're going to stand out. And in the world that we're living in today, that goes 100% more. Like, you have to find ways to create opportunities for yourself and to stand out, from my experience anyway.
That's an amazing story. So you learned Spanish?
So I learned Spanish, totally fluent now.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, I want to just share one thing, and then I want to go back to the Barcelona experience.
Okay.
It's so pivotal for me. But I ended up learning Spanish, and the way things work in a serendipitous way, I ended up using that Spanish later in a career after my career with CBC. Ended up becoming the director of communications and the chief spokesperson for the Toronto 2015 Pan Am and Para-Pan Am Games, which of course Hamilton played a big role in. One of the reasons I got that job is because I spoke Spanish. So it shows you, that, these little decisions that you make at different points in your life can have a huge impact going forward. And just to go back to Barcelona for me was a turning point in my career, and super important. It was where I ended up actually meeting my wife. She's from Latin America, grew up in Colombia, was studying architecture, doing her postgraduate work in Barcelona, and we met that year. Had no idea that was going to happen. So that was just the gold medal on top of all the other gold medals I was. But from a career point of view, I'm living in Spain at this hugely important year of news in that part of the world. It was the 500th anniversary of the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain. So there was all kinds of news stories that I ended up writing about that. It was the year that the World's Fair was happening in Seville in Spain. And so at that time, the World's Fair was still huge. So I ended up going down to Seville and covering that. And then in terms of the Olympics, I ended up doing a ton of work for CBC on the Olympic side. But more importantly, almost every single Canadian journalist left, actually everyone that I can remember left after the Olympics ended. And I was the only one who actually, because I was living there, stayed on and had this wonderful opportunity to cover the Paralympics. And the Paralympics for athletes with disabilities was this incredible event that very few people were reporting on. And the interesting part for me was everybody who was covering the Olympics was making a huge deal, and rightfully so, about Silken Laumann. She was this top world champion rower from Canada who 3 months before the games had this horrible, horrible accident in training where it looked like she was going to have trouble walking again, let alone competing in the Olympics. Well, she made this remarkable recovery in 3 months, ends up almost being carried into the boat to compete on that day at the Olympics, wins a bronze medal, and they end up doing on CTV a made-for-TV movie about her and her story. And the interesting thing was, before that accident, there were very few people outside of rowing that knew about Silken and her story. And what I found really intriguing was all of these Paralympic athletes, 2 weeks after all the Olympics ended, had stories that were as powerful, if not more so, than Silken's story about things that they had overcome in terms of adversity. And there were few people there. Actually, I was the only one from Canada telling those stories. So what was interesting was I'm covering every single day for 2 weeks these incredibly powerful stories back to Canada. And that got me seen by all of the powers that be back at CBC. So suddenly they're saying, who is this Teddy Katz guy? Because he's actually pretty good. And I would say, well, I was okay. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. That ended up becoming, as I say, a huge moment in my life, in my career. I became a huge advocate for athletes with disabilities. To this day, in some of the clients that I work with now and for my journalism and communications company still involve Paralympic stories, and working with the International Paralympic Committee in particular, because I still think, even though we've come a long way since 1992 and the stories are much better told today, we still have a long way to go on that front, in my opinion.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, that's PATH's motto as well, helping folks that identify as having a disability, right, find work, and inclusivity and accommodations, and it's still a struggle. It's still a struggle in many ways. And
well, one of the things that I think we don't see is a lot of times people with disabilities, we don't talk about some of the struggles, like the difficulties finding employment or the difficulties with accessibility. And these are things that we should have, that are part of our conscious, but we don't think about these things enough, and we need to. And that's my hope through telling some of the Paralympic stories, that we'll start thinking about these stories as we rightfully are starting to think about other areas where we need to improve in society. This is another one of those areas. And in fact, the people that I'm very close to from the International Paralympic Committee, they actually say, we hope, as bad as the pandemic has been, and it's been bad for all of us, we hope that when it ends, that we don't go back to normalcy as we knew it, because we shut out too many people from our society in coming in and leading into the pandemic. So hopefully our new normal will take into account some of these things as we move forward.
Yeah, and I believe we're all fighting for it. So hopefully the fight continues and changes, become more permanent, and it's not something that just gets swept under the rug and we forget again. And yeah, exactly. We can't go back to what the normal was, because it wasn't good for everybody.
No, absolutely not. And that's the one great thing that the Paralympics has done is raised awareness of people with incredible abilities,
Mhm.
but we also need to see all of the issues. Like the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, really wants going forward to be a vehicle for social change and for social inclusion. And I
Mhm.
think that that's more needed now than ever.
Absolutely. Absolutely agree. So how did your journey, where did your journey take you after Barcelona? Did you end up staying there longer and then coming back here? Because
So
you're back in Hamilton now, and I'm
yeah,
wondering why, because Spanish is so beautiful.
yeah, that was interesting because I ended up living in Spain for a year.
Yep.
And at the time I was fluent in Spanish, but the difficulty that I had was I didn't see myself being able to work as a journalist, as a
Okay.
working journalist, writing in Spanish,
Mhm.
because I had
Okay.
picked it up so late in life. So I thought, okay, I got to come back to Canada. I ended up dragging my wife back with me because she's similar to you. She's like, hey, we're gonna leave Barcelona. But don't get me wrong, she's actually more Canadian probably now than I am. She just
Yeah.
loves it. But having said that, I came back and I ended up getting incredible opportunities, I think in large part because of the body of work that I did in that year in Barcelona. I ended
Mhm.
up working at CBC. I ended up working there for almost 2 decades, for almost 20 years. I had the most incredible job. It ended up being a national reporter covering a lot of the most important sports, global sports events around the world. So I ended up having the chance to go back to quite a number of Olympics and Paralympic, Commonwealth Games, Pan Am Games, the World Cup of Soccer. But my job was a little bit different. A lot of people say, wow, that's so amazing, whatever. And it was, but
Mhm.
I always was challenged to try and find the story behind the story at
Mhm.
any of those events. Like what would be, I would go to the World Cup of Soccer, for instance, and try and tell the story of, why is this event meaningful to somebody who's not that interested in sports, like my mother would be. Like,
Mhm.
she
Mhm.
doesn't really care all that much about sports. So how can I make it interesting to somebody like her? And that was always a huge challenge. You'd be at these events. Like there was this one incredible game where I think it was playing Ghana playing Uruguay at the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. And it was this incredible moment in time, a moment in history, because for the first time ever, there was this major sports event, the World Cup of Soccer, happening in Africa. And that it was almost like the whole continent had stopped and was cheering for Ghana in this game against Uruguay. And it was like, you'd walk around the stadium and you'd see, this white family from South Africa with a wig in the colors of the Ghanaian flag. And I would go up to them and say, tell me about that. Why are you dressed like that? And they said to me, well, this is such an important moment in time for us in Africa. We're always viewed in a certain way, and we want to change that. And this is our opportunity to do so. And
Mhm.
so I just love moments like that. Like I said to you earlier, Catherine, like sport tells us so much about some of the political, cultural struggles and everything else that we have, and it just offers this incredible insight. And I wanted to bring that back to listeners in Canada, and had this incredible opportunity to do that. And I did that for, as I say, for about 20 years. At, at a certain time, I started to get a little bit tired of what we're now seeing, of all the demands of journalists.
Mhm.
Um, I felt it was such an incredible responsibility to go and tell the facts as much as best as you can find them.
Mhm.
Um, it was for me what I really appreciated about journalism. I was telling you in the preparation for today, what I really appreciated was people will tell you their stories if you build connections with them.
Mhm. Yep.
And that it's almost like this high that I get when I do an interview with somebody and they share some insight and some intimate details of their life and their story, because I built a relationship with them and they know they can trust me in how I will report it back to
Mhm.
the public. And that was something that I loved, and I still love to this day. I love telling the stories that are untold that really need to get more to be better told, and to have more Canadians or more people around the world hearing them. But I also love this ability, or this opportunity, to have people share those intimate moments with you, because you built a bit of a trust relationship with them. And a great story that I can share about that on that front is I was at the Pan Am Games in Winnipeg in 1999, and there was a rower at the time who was quite famous, and she knew me very well and knew this other reporter from the Toronto Star very well. And she took us aside and took us underneath a bridge at the rowing venue,
Mhm.
because she was very upset about something that had happened. There was a teammate on the Canadian team, the non-rower, who was doing a lot of promotional work for those games and was reportedly getting paid a significant sum of money, but wasn't participating in the games in the way that she really felt this athlete should be competing. And
Mhm.
so she went under the bridge and starts telling myself and this Toronto Star reporter how upset she is, and starts recording this all on tape. And we're both sort of saying to her, you do realize this is going to be a front page story in the Toronto Star and on CBC radio. And she's like, yes, but I trust you guys that you'll report it in the right way.
Mhm.
And that kind of thing, like for me, it's like, that's a huge responsibility, but I love that. I love that. And that's something that to this day is, I think, what fuels me to get out of bed in the morning
Mhm.
is this opportunity to be able to hear those stories and to be able to share them, and to have people want to use me as their, use me is not the right terminology, but be able to leverage my skill set to be able to tell the
Mhm.
stories, to help them get their stories told, as loudly as possible in this world where there's a lot of noise.
Mhm. And trust you enough with their story to bring it forward. That's awesome. Yeah.
It really is amazing, and that, again, that's something that to this day, I love the most about journalism. But I was just coming back to why I decided to leave CBC.
Mhm.
Um, I remember being at the Olympics in London in 2012, the,
Mhm.
the last Olympics that I went to for CBC. And, if you weren't writing a blog at that time, you had to be out on Twitter, or you had to be doing television hits or doing a radio story. And it got me thinking, like, if you're doing all of these things and you're busy 24 hours a day, 7 days a week when you're at this event, how do you actually go and build the relationships and
Mhm.
build that trust, and get the opportunity to have people share stories with you? It's not easy,
No.
and it became less enjoyable for me, and that's why I decided, the Pan Am Games came to Toronto, and the GTA Hamilton as well. And I thought, you know what, this is a different way that I can help tell stories. I can help tell the story of why these games are important and some of the benefits. And that's what I did. I joined the organizing committee, and went, as some people say, went to the dark side, where you start, instead of being a journalist, you're now leading communications. And I did that for 3 years. The games went off. It was actually quite a difficult period, because you know there was a lot of work, and a lot of people didn't really see the benefits early on until the
Mhm.
games came, and then they saw how the games brought the communities to life all over Ontario. I think for the most part, everybody has a great memory of that. So that was great. And then after that, I decided, you know what, I want to try and help small organizations with their storytelling. I did that for a few years in the educational sphere with a company that really needed to get their story better told around Canada. And then about 2 years ago, I decided to do that on my own. So now I help companies in Canada, but also around the world, telling their stories and finding ways to, as I say, cut through all the noise that's out there, because it's a very noisy environment. You know, one of the areas that I like to do a lot of is in podcasting. Well, there's like 5 million podcasts out there. So how do you do a podcast that's actually going to be listened to by people and you know, get to the right audience? Well, that's the kind of, you know, because I have this background as a journalist and as a communicator, that's where I like to help companies, nonprofits, what have you, maneuver through that, because a lot of people are struggling in that area.
Yeah, there's a lot of noise. You get confused, and even as a person who's trying to learn and navigate that, you don't know what to read anymore because there's just so much information out there. It's information overload. And on a perspective as a business, how do you stand out? How do you get your story to the point where somebody wants to listen to it and read it, or, you know, engage in your business? It's a tough job. It's a
And that's
tough
where
job you've taken on.
well, that's where being a journalist actually helps, because
Yeah.
you know, you're trained at doing that, at, you know, simplifying messages and thinking about, you know, I remember one of my first journalism profs, he used to always say, um, assume people know nothing and assume people don't care, and write your story with those two things in mind. And it was really, as you can see, it was one of the first things he said in class in my first year of, you know, or second year of journalism school, and it stuck with me to this day. So, you know, as a trained journalist, I often feel we're now, you know, we've seen in the last week or so, there's been horrible cuts of journalism positions all over the country, and it's been awful to see. But I often, you know, I've reached out to a couple of those people and I said, you know, I think the need for good communicators, good journalists, is now needed more than ever. You know, we need to really help all of these organizations that are really struggling right now. So while it's difficult, there are opportunities, but sometimes I think you almost have to create those opportunities on your own first, and show people
Yeah.
what you can do or what they can, and then you can pull them along and they can see for themselves.
So did you think way back when you were younger, when you started on this path, that you'd end up where you are right now? Like, is this something that you hoped one day would happen, or it just organically happened?
I think it organically happened. I didn't actually ever think about, you know, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to run my own business. I'm going to combine communications and journalism. In fact, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, you can't do that. Like, the two don't go together. And I remember there was one day I was at CBC and they asked me, the assignment editor asked me to do a story about who was going to win that year's version of the Battle of the Blades, where they match a figure skater with a hockey player, whatever. I said to them, I have 10 other stories that we could be doing that are actual stories. This isn't about a made-for-TV show that CBC is doing. These are stories about concussions or about this issue or that issue in sport that I think is more important for me to do than the story of who wins Battle of the Blades. And thankfully, I'd been there enough years and they took me up on that. But that was my response 10 years ago. And now I think my mind has shifted a little bit, because, you know, it's only natural that organizations are going to try and do promotions around some of the work that they do in some ways, because if they don't, their ability to keep going, I don't know how they can do it. And I remember I was asked about 2 or 3 years ago to go and speak as a guest speaker to a former colleague's class at Ryerson. And his class was for public relations students and journalism students. It was a combination of both. And his question that I was trying to answer that night is, how much of journalism today is public relations, and how much of public relations is journalism? And what he meant by that was, you know, as a public relations or a communications person, a lot of times you're writing your own story for the website or for a blog or whatever, trying to get people to pay attention the way a journalist would. And you
Yeah.
don't necessarily have to go through a journalist or a newspaper or a broadcast outlet or what have you in order to get that story out there these days.
Mhm.
But
That's
it's
cool.
really
Yeah.
interesting because I think the lines have become a lot grayer than they once were, at least when I had that experience 10 years ago at CBC.
Interesting. So what's your job right now? Like what kind of companies, you said you work with nonprofit, and like is there sports still in there? Are you still doing the sports stories?
Sport still plays a role, but I
Mhm.
work with companies of all kinds. So
Yeah.
I've worked with companies in the education sphere. I've worked with companies basically who are just looking for professional
Hmm.
written material. I do a lot of work for the International Paralympic Committee. So I was hoping to go and be part of their media team at the Tokyo Paralympics, which of course were canceled.
Hmm.
Hopefully they'll go ahead this summer, and I'm hoping I'll be part. I was supposed to actually be going to be on the ground in Tokyo to sort of tell the big story of the day, so that they can get their message out around the world in a way that they
Hmm.
haven't in the past. And I'm not sure if that's going to happen in the same way going forward. So yeah, I do a variety of work, whether it's thought leadership, trying to help organizations think about, how can we get our executives to be seen as thought leaders. I do that for some organizations. I do a lot of writing, as I say, for different organizations. And one of the things that I found is, again, people need this kind of help. Like if and one of the things that I found as well, going back to the first lesson that I learned working for my dad's company, if you have created and nurtured a network, and if you have built a bit of a reputation over time about the kind of person you are and the kind of professional you are, when you go out and you start your own business and you start to talk to people about what are the gaps and opportunities with respect to communications and journalism, whatever, that gave me everybody and anybody was willing to meet with me when I started out 2 years ago. And I bought them all coffees. I had more coffee than anybody probably should have in their lifetime. And I had that in about a 2-month period, trying
Yeah.
to get a lay of the land of where people needed help
Hmm.
and just listening to them, being a good listener, which is, I think, what's helped me as a journalist, being a good listener as a small business owner as well, really helped me position where I thought my passions were and where my skill set were, and sort of place that and use and leverage that network uh, in ways that have really helped me be successful. And we've all struggled during this pandemic. Don't get me wrong. I've had contracts that I've had ongoing have suddenly been on pause, but other things have come out of the woodwork as well. And as long as you find ways to, again, to showcase to people different things that you might be able to do that maybe they're not even thinking about yet,
Hmm. Yeah.
um, they're willing to listen, and they're willing to listen to good, creative, new, out of the box ideas. So opportunities still do come forth, but
Hmm.
but you can't sit and wait for them to come forth.
No.
You have to go out searching a little bit, and you have to hustle, and you can't be afraid to hustle, which is something that I thank God my dad gave me that as kind of my base, because I think it was so helpful for me to be in the position I'm in now.
Yep. There's some advice and there's some things that you learn in your life that if you remember and you follow those when you're older, it was the best advice and experiences that you had. There's just, yeah, especially the few things that you mentioned with your family business and networking and building relationships. You obviously still carry that to this day. So great experience as a child.
And I'm not shy about it too, Catherine. We were talking about this before too.
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, um, I'm a bit of an introvert,
Mhm.
but but I kind of I kind of changed my personality when it comes to my professional, career.
Mhm.
When it comes to being a journalist, I'm not shy. Like I know I have a job to do, and my job is to ask the questions that CBC listeners or others might
Mhm.
be asking. So there was a really cute story that I'd like to share for a couple
Sure.
seconds
Yeah.
of a moment that I had at CBC several years ago. People
Mhm.
might remember this. So Brian Burke was the general manager. He was, the head honcho of the Toronto Maple Leafs for a few years.
Mhm.
And at this particular time, he was giving his end of the year sort of annual address. What went right? What went wrong? What went right? And they were struggling, as Toronto often does year after year, especially at that time. And I asked the question to Brian Burke when I was there for CBC. I asked him a question. Do you ever regret maybe setting the bar and setting the expectations too high in a city like Toronto that always expects the most and always expects this team to go and win that Stanley Cup that they haven't won since 19 whatever, all these years. Um, do you regret now not sort of saying to people, you know what, we might struggle for a couple of years, but that's okay. Hang in there, be patient. We'll get some top draft picks, you know, kind of like I said to him, kind of like the Pittsburgh model. So he said, the Pittsburgh model, and he responded very, very, he lashed out at the reporter, who was me, and he said, the Pittsburgh model, they got the lottery. They won the lottery and they won the best player in the world. What do you want me to win the lottery as well? Like he just lashed out, and that clip ended up being posted on YouTube. It has something like 20,000 views. Uh, People dragged it out again this week because Brian Burke was just announced as the new GM of Pittsburgh, of all
Oh,
places.
well, of
So
all places.
so people dragged out the clip, and there I am again with my voice being, nobody remembers who the guy asked the question. They remember the answer, which is the way it should be, by the way. But
Mhm.
anyway, it made me feel about 2 feet tall, but it was a question that needed to be asked.
Mhm.
And that is, what was interesting for me was, here I am, this introvert, but I also had this curiosity. I felt I was doing the job not just for myself, but for all the listeners out there.
Mhm.
You need to ask the tough questions. You need to try to get the facts. And again, you need to try to build that trust and be a good listener. And thankfully, some of those things came rather more naturally to me than the shyness. And that was a constant battle trying to get over that.
Well, your career and your journey has been amazing. I mean, I'm the same, but this is probably as far as I can go with communication and journalism.
Well, you
Just,
never know. The more you do it, that's the other thing that I'd say to your listeners. No
mm,
matter what you do, the more you
yeah.
do it, the more comfortable you get.
That's true. I
It,
can say if I watch my first interview that I did for the Let's Talk, and now I think the first interview was 10 minutes. I mean, it's mostly my guests, though. I mean, my guests have stories. Every guest has a different journey that they've traveled, not always a straight, narrow path. And it's been an incredible learning experience. So thank you for sharing yours with me, Teddy. I really appreciate it.
well, I thank you for having me, Catherine. And the other thing I just want to say to people is, just do it. Like the old Nike slogan. I hate sort of corporate slogan things, but
Mhm.
Nike's is a pretty good one to have in the back of your mind. Just do.
Yep. Yep.
I've been sort of hemming and hawing about this podcast that I want to do, and part of me is, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I want to have everything just right.
Mhm.
Can't do that. Just
No.
do it. Like
Good.
if you have a good idea,
Yep.
start it, show it to people, and you'll be surprised where it can take you.
Yep. Great advice. That's great advice for our guests. So, anything else that you would recommend, or any advice for someone thinking of getting into this career or changing into this career?
Do a lot of reading. Um, really follow the people that, maybe there's somebody out there who you really like. Follow what they do. If
Mhm.
so, maybe reach out to them. Do I started out volunteering, at community television channel, cable 14 at the time.
Okay.
I learned a lot there. I volunteered wherever I could. If you have the ability to do that, it's a great way to build those connections, to find your way into the industry. Get off the beaten path if you can, like I did. I always say, if you want to try and find an opportunity, you might be able to create one outside of where everybody else is thinking. So that's kind of important to think about. And you really just have to start somewhere, like do a podcast, write a blog if you're interested, like show people what makes you tick, what's your passion, what makes you, what can you do to differentiate yourself from the next person. And the more you do that, I think the more potential opportunity you might have, because then you can take that to maybe somebody who is particularly interested in that field or that niche.
Yep.
And then go from there.
Great advice. That's awesome. Well, thank you again, Teddy, for being my guest. It was nice seeing you and catching up and hearing so much more about you. I appreciate what you do, and good luck and much success with your business going forward.
Well, thank you, Catherine, and I appreciate you having the interest in talking to me. And good luck to everybody on their career paths.
Thank you so much, Teddy.
Bye for now.
Bye.